Hey guys, so today we're doing the second part of the rhetorical appeals, academic persuasion and logic, focusing mostly on logic and when our attempt to use logic goes wrong, so logical fallacies. This presentation usually goes a lot better face to face because there's a lot of practice in it. So I'm just going to kind of have to walk you through it without the practice component. So you'll just kind of have to bear with me on that. So just a quick overview. When I say logical fallacies, I kind of just mean like logical untruths or faulty logic. Sometimes I'll say bad logic or unfair logic. We said that the use of logic is making what you're saying, your reason with the evidence and how you're explaining it, making that make sense to your reader. So basically a logical fallacy is something that when you hear it, it might make sense at first, but if you really pick it apart, something seems off in terms of how it makes sense or how it comes together. It's often if your reader picks up on the fact that you're doing this or that you've made an error, then it's, inaccurate or misleading information, and it does actually weaken your argument. And a lot of times popular arguments will attempt to use logical fallacies often to try to kind of manipulate people. And unfairly use things like emotion and bad appeals to credibility and things like that, assuming or hoping that the reader won't pick up on it, because logical fallacies can be very convincing if your reader doesn't pick up on it. But if they do, then it can kind of shoot you in the foot. So sometimes it's unintentional. We use bad logic all the time. I know no one wants to think about themselves as using bad logic, but we do it all the time in like casual conversations, like kind of everyday communication without even realizing it accidentally. So it's not always intentional. And we do it in writing a lot unintentionally. Sometimes it's malicious because the person arguing is relying on the audience ignorance of the issue. So not assuming that you don't know much about it to be able to pick up what they're doing, or relying on audience trust. A lot of times when we watch different news stations, I know we kind of know that there's, some bias in the news, but I think especially when we're watching like the one that we trust, like there's some implicit trust there. Like this is, and we do it, online when we read articles, there's this implicit sort of like, they have been researching this issue, or they are the one that was there on the scene, or they are a professional, and of course they know more about this than I do. So some relying on that implicit trust, or believing that you're not going to look into the issue. And a lot of times, we're bombarded with information all day long and people's opinions and arguments about things. So, in reality, we don't have time necessarily to look further into every argument that we come across, and sometimes people will use that to their advantage. So it's important to recognize, so the goal of this presentation is not that you memorize every single logical fallacy out there, but that you do get in the habit of noticing when someone's, I guess, feeding you a line, or when something sounds a little bit off. Not just to avoid it in your communication, but to notice when it's coming at you as a critical reader. So there's a couple of types or ways that logical fallacies happen. They are used to distract, distort, or omit information. So either, distract you from the real point, and get you focused on something else. To distort, like, that's usually like in the wording, or in how they're portraying an issue maybe unfairly. Omitting information, so that's when we're like omitting evidence that makes us look wrong, things like that. It often happens by over-relying on another appeal besides logic. So in an attempt to convince your reader to think that what you're saying makes sense, we lean too much into emotional or authoritative appeals, or even disguise those appeals as logic. Like using a celebrity. Like if you, used a celebrity to endorse your product and they had no expertise, you're relying on that name or the fact that people like or admire that person and not their actual expertise. And that's an unfair, like leaning into an authoritative appeal because the person's not actually an authority. When it's emotion, it's relying unfairly on the audience's emotion. So we talked about how pathos is really easy to kind of manipulate. When you're relying unfairly on guilt or insecurity, fear, and you kind of target and focus more on that. authority or trust. So again, focusing on authority where none exists, like our cultural use of celebrities, or focusing on solely on character assassination. So focusing on picking apart this person's character as opposed to their actual argument. And logic, again, that's distorting, that's distracting, omitting like the evidence that's being presented. I want to make this clarification really quick. Disagreeing is not the same thing as bad logic. You can disagree with someone and both of you can have solid logic. It's often not about the issue itself when we're talking about logic or a whole group of people. We're talking about an individual presentation of ideas. A logical fallacy is how this person is presenting their ideas in this moment. It's situational. So a couple of things to think about in terms of how this works is that two people can have differing views and both make valid points. That's why it's important to really be a critical reader and think about and thinker and see potential gray area in the situation in a conversation. The conversation exists because all the people involved think they have valid points. And often they do have valid points and valid concerns. It's possible for, differing views to both have solid points and exist within the same conversation. It's not just black and white, yes or no, right or wrong. And the goal of persuasion is to convince your audience that your ideas are valid and worth considering, that what you're saying makes sense. Not necessarily that you are 100% right and they should completely disregard every concern that they have and agree with you. False. So again, like kind of coming back to the idea that faulty logic is rarely about the issue itself. It's about how that writer or speaker at that time is going about trying to convince others in that situation. It's a failure to present your ideas fairly and accurately based on evidence. So we're going to go through a couple of, actually quite a few examples. Normally in class I would show you the example and have you tell me what's wrong, but I'm going to have to just kind of talk you through it with this one, or with some of these practices. So the first one is, my roommate said her philosophy class was hard, and the one I'm in is hard too. All philosophy classes must be hard. So I want you to try to think about, before we go on to the explanation, about what might be wrong here. Think about a couple of things like how many people that they are kind of pulling this information from. It's one speaker and then her friend. If you think about the number of people that are in your classes, our class is pretty small. I think a standard philosophy class would have about 40 to 45, maybe 50 people in it. And those are probably pretty big. Or in terms of like having a large number of classes being offered. The main issue here is that two people's experiences are not enough to base a conclusion on, and that's one of the reasons. It's kind of similar in this circumstance with this example to false anecdotal evidence, or weak anecdotal evidence. One of the reasons not to base everything on personal experience, one of the reasons people say be careful about that, because again, like, just because it happened to one person or you had one experience with it doesn't necessarily make it true if you don't have a lot of other things backing it up. It helps to kind of create generalizations where we make like sweeping assumptions about a whole group of people, range of classes, places, job types, based on an inadequate sample. And it's often the kind of fallacy that's responsible for creating stereotypes. This is one of my favorite ones. Animal experimentation reduces our respect for life. If we don't respect life, we are more and more tolerant. We are likely to be more and more tolerant of violent acts like war and murder. Soon our society will become a battlefield in which everyone constantly fears for their lives. It will be the end of civilization. To prevent this terrible consequence, we should make animal experimentation illegal right now. The first problem here is that animal experimentation has actually been illegal for some time. And civilization has not yet ended, so it's pretty evident that this chain of events is not going to happen, that civilization is not going to end. And I want to kind of make this point too, that it doesn't mean that you can't make a good argument for why animal experimentation should be illegal. Again, it's situational. It's about how this person is presenting the ideas in this circumstance, not the issue as a whole. this is an example of a logical fallacy. Doesn't necessarily mean that the claim itself is bad. It means that this person is going about making a bad argument for it. Problem number 2 is that if we believe animal experimentation, that first part, even if we believe that animal experimentation reduces the respect for life, and the loss of respect for life makes us more tolerant of violence, we could follow it until then, and then that's sort of like the spot on the hillside where it kind of stops. Like, we probably aren't going to slide all the way down to the end of civilization, and that's why this is called a slippery slope, because the idea is that it's a chain reaction, meaning that if you take one small step in this direction, it's going to end in some dire consequence that's irreversible and that you won't be able to stop. We use this a lot with news when people are reporting about like new policies and things happening. If we vote this way, if we do this, if we allow this to happen, terrible, terrible things will happen and it'll be the end of the world and all this kind of stuff. And it's okay to to use a chain of reasoning for an argument, but you have to be able to prove, like, you have to have some kind of evidence to show that this consequence could happen, not just rely on fear. And this is an example of using emotion unfairly, because with this chain of reasoning, they're just relying on people's fear, as opposed to kind of targeting that, as opposed to using any evidence. This is another one of my favorites. Guns are like hammers. They're both tools with metal parts that could be used to kill someone, and yet it would be ridiculous to restrict the purchase of hammers. So restrictions on purchasing guns are equally ridiculous. Okay, but a lot of people, like, when you hear this, it makes sense at first. We actually see arguments like this all the time, and it makes sense at first because you're comparing two things and you're like, okay, yeah, right. But there's a problem with making this kind of comparison. Guns and hammers do share certain features. They're metal, they have metal parts, they can be tools, they could potentially be used for violence. But when people are talking about like guns versus hammers, they usually are having different conversations and different debates. When we're thinking about restricting guns, we're usually talking about being able to kill large numbers of people at a distance very quickly. We're usually talking about mass violence and things like that. Those aren't really the things we're talking about when we're discussing hammers. I do not know what people discuss when they are talking about hammers, but I assume it has to do with how they're made and the price and that kind of stuff. And when it comes down to it, you can compare any two things. And that's why this is a weak analogy. And we see these all the time without necessarily catching the problem at first, because we think in comparisons. You know, I said it's important to have examples and use examples to explain yourself, because and to use visuals, because we'll always try to teach people a new thing by explaining it and then saying, for example, and then pulling something they are aware of, they already know, and trying to make a comparison to help them understand it. We learn by these kinds of comparisons. But when you're trying to compare two things to make an argument, the things you're comparing have to be, in both cases, the relevant parts of the conversation. In order to compare guns to hammers, we have to also, when we're talking about hammers, be talking about mass violence. And because we're talking about two different things, it's not necessarily fair to compare them, because you can compare any two things. Again, like if I had this drink bottle in class and it were full, maybe I could use this to ricochet it around the room. And I could say, you know, guns are like this Diet Mountain Dew bottle. Or I could say guns are like this book. You know, if I were creative enough, I could maybe use this to hurt somebody. But again, like, you can take any two things and make a comparison, because they're the same color, or they have, again, like, guns and hammers have the same parts. But you have to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more fair than that when you're trying to make a comparison. Just being able to compare any two things doesn't necessarily prove much if you're not talking about things that are relevant to both topics. The next one, this should be pretty easy. We should abolish the death penalty. Many respected people, such as actor Ryan Gosling, have publicly stated their opposition to it. This one, the what's wrong here, should be pretty obvious. Ryan Gosling is an authority on acting. Maybe, that's debatable. But there's no reason why anyone pull this down. There's no reason why anyone should be moved by his political opinions, because again, this is using a celebrity, and you'll notice that when it comes time to vote and anything with politics, is we put who all your favorite artists and athletes and actors are going to vote for, because they assume if people like and admire those people, then they're more likely to vote for this person, and that's an unfair use of authority. Because these people aren't exactly more of an expert than anybody that would be sitting in like our classroom. So it's not necessarily fair. This one is a little bit trickier, and I'm gonna kind of break this one down a little bit. So same-sex marriages are immoral. 70% of Americans think so. So the what's wrong here is a little bit tricky. And the main thing, and we're going to go with me on this and assume that I pulled this from a real study and that 70% of Americans actually did believe this. The problem is that when it comes to majority opinion, you can only use that to prove certain things. And the only thing you can really use it to prove is people's preference, what people want, what people believe in that moment. We use it, for voting. And we use it to elect politicians and pass things just because we're going for what the highest number of people want. But you can't necessarily determine moral versus immoral based on popular opinion, because morals can be situational, they can be personal, they can be cultural, they can be based on religious beliefs, family values, and they can change. If you look back through history, you could see lots of times when we thought something, or when groups of people thought something was moral or thought something was okay, and then their opinion changed later. So just the fact that a lot of people think it's moral or immoral right now doesn't necessarily prove that it is, because it's difficult to prove a belief or a preference or a value because they're not static. And when we're thinking about using numbers this way to try to prove something in this way, it's called ad populum fallacy, where you're taking advantage of people's desire to be liked and to fit in and to not go against the grain. And kind of that feeling that like, well, if 70% of people believe this, there must be something wrong with me. I must have missed something. They must know something that I don't. The instinct that you're going to question yourself in the face of so many other people thinking something or believing something. The most common type of this is a bandwagon fallacy, where again, it's just based on what everyone else is supposed to do. You've heard the get on the bandwagon, and it kind of is goes with that saying, if all your friends were going to jump off of a bridge, would you do it too? I don't know if your parents ever asked you that, but I did. But mine did. The assuming just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean that you should do it too. That's also kind of a bandwagon fallacy. Just kind of appealing to a large number of people or a popular opinion in order to sway someone. Caldwell Hall is in bad shape. Either we tear it down and put up a new building, or we continue to risk student safety. Obviously, we shouldn't risk anyone's safety, so we must tear the building down. There's a couple of things wrong here. If you notice, it says it's in bad shape, but doesn't really define what bad means. Like, is bad that the building is caving in or that the plumbing is out? Either we tear it down or put up a new building. There's two options here. They both seem pretty like opposite ends of a potential spectrum. But there's nothing really given that's like inside that spectrum. So they neglect to say some important things like, one, what bad means. Two, that they could repair the building or find some way to protect students from risk. They could work on the part of the building that is having a problem and use the other part of the building. Make some updates and fix some problems instead of just tearing the building down. It's called a false dichotomy. It's one of the ones that's in the video that I asked you to watch. And they have their own examples that are good too. But it kind of sets up the situation. There are two choices. Advertisements do this a lot, where it's either this or it's that. Either you buy this product or you continue to have this horrible problem without considering the fact that there are lots of other products out there. You set it up to seem like there's only two choices, even when there might be more. One sounds terrible, and the other one is the arguer's option. So obviously you would pick the one that sounds reasonable and not the one that sounds ridiculous. But again, it's a fallacy because you're not presenting the situation fairly. You're distorting it and omitting other options. Even when things are often much more complex than that. Okay, so this one, I picked a controversial topic for this one, because I kind of want to prove a point, and I picked the wording of, I picked two statements based on opposite sides. So this is something, abortion is something people usually feel really strongly about, one side or the other. So I want you to think about which one of these statements describes your opinion. People who think abortion should be banned have no respect for the rights of women. They treat them as nothing but baby-making machines. That's wrong. Women must have the right to choose. The other side, people who are in favor of abortion think that it's okay to commit cold-blooded murder. The main thing you might have noticed is whichever side you happen to be on, the statement that described you probably didn't sound very fair. That's probably not how you would describe yourself. And if another person was talking to you and said that that's what you think or how you feel about it, you would probably be pretty offended. And neither of these opinions described this way sound very valid or sound very fleshed out. That's a straw man fallacy. It's also one of the ones from the video. It's where you do address the other side, but you set it up to be so weak. And you're just trying to score points by knocking it down, just like a straw man is not fleshed out. And a lot easier to knock over than a real man. A straw man argument is a weak version that's easy to knock down. You're stating it, but you're wording it in a way that makes it easier for you to refute because you're not presenting the whole picture. And you're not doing it fairly. It is appropriate to respond to opposing views, but you have to think about, knocking down a view that once you've worded it unfairly isn't super impressive. So if you have to do that, then you may need to rethink either what you understand about the other side, or reconsider your stance on the issue. And it's something to be really careful of in your digital essay, because especially controversial issues people feel strongly about, we tend to do this a lot. And I noticed this error a lot in digital essays, and that's one of the things that goes against like building your credibility and being fair-minded is not doing things like this, making sure that when you are describing the other side that you're doing it without this supercharged emotional extreme language that offends the other side rather than really fleshes out what their concerns are and does it fairly. John McCain is such a hypocrite. He wants to reform campaign funding, yet he's taken plenty of contributions in the past. I'm using an old example here. The thing that's wrong here might not be, it might not be offhand, like easy to catch. And it is another one of the examples from the video. It's called a tu quo qui. It doesn't actually matter if he's a hypocrite. I know that sounds weird. But it's a type of character assassination, a bad appeal to, a bad use of authority, when it's okay to pinpoint problems in the person's character if those problems directly impact the argument that they're making. In this case, whether or not we need to reform campaign funding is a much bigger issue, and it doesn't actually matter whether or not John McCain individually always adhered to that. It doesn't necessarily take away from the validity of the claim. If someone else made that argument that, didn't, have any sort of hypocritical or inconsistent practices, we would listen to it. So it doesn't necessarily take away from the argument. So, it's kind of like, I guess a better example or an easier example is if a smoker tells you not to smoke, the fact that they don't follow their own advice doesn't necessarily negate the dangers of smoking. It doesn't necessarily mean that you should now smoke and that smoking isn't dangerous because they happen to be hypocritical. They might know better than anybody what the dangers of smoking would be. So again, like sometimes it's kind of, we also call it the you too fallacy, is where we point out personal inconsistency in the speaker as opposed to focusing on the claim itself. And it's a tricky type of logical fallacy. I'm going to pull this down just a little bit. Sorry, so you can see it better. The seriousness of the punishment should match the seriousness of a crime. Right now, the punishment for drunk driving may simply be a fine, but drunk driving is a very serious crime that can kill innocent people. So the death penalty the death penalty should be the punishment for drunk driving. Hopefully you picked up on a couple of things wrong here. One, they say the word serious a whole lot. Seriousness of a punishment should match the seriousness of a crime. Drunk driving is a serious crime. And then they jump to the death penalty. They don't really do a lot of fleshing out of the word serious. And it does seem like they're making a good argument right up until here. And then they jump straight to the end. Like they switch to drunk driving. And it seems like they missed something in the argument. Like they missed something here before they got to the drunk driving. And it is called missing the point. It's a type of kind of like distraction. The argument here doesn't support the conclusion. The punishment, and the conclusion is that the punishment for drunk driving should be very serious. Yes, that's the conclusion, but it doesn't necessarily support the death penalty. We didn't actually, there's lots of other types of serious punishments, right, that match the seriousness of a crime. Doesn't necessarily make the case that the death penalty should be the serious punishment. So it does kind of miss something. I'm going to read two examples here, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of catch what's missing. The United Pacifists of America decided to run a poll to determine what Americans think about guns and gun control. Jane is assigned the task of setting up the study. To save mailing costs, she includes the survey form in the group's newsletter mailing. She is very pleased to find out that 95% of those surveyed favor gun control laws, and she tells her friends that the vast majority of Americans favor gun control laws. So one thing to pay attention to here is the fact that a pacifist is someone who doesn't approve of violence. So that can maybe give you a hint here. Large-scale polls were taken in Florida, California, and Maine, all states that that are on the coast. And it was found that the average of 55% of those polled spend at least 14 days a year near the ocean. So it can be safely concluded that 55% of all Americans spend at least 14 days each year near the ocean. Okay, so what's wrong here is that this is false anecdotal evidence. When the anecdotal evidence is, or when the evidence that you're using, when the sample size that you're using is non-representative, when you can't necessarily draw that conclusion to it, it's more of an exception to the rule. And it's one reason to be careful of statistics and studies. Just because there was a study conducted doesn't mean it was conducted fairly. In this case, I'm going to go back to the examples. In this case, they just sent it out to pacifists, to people that only have the one opinion. They didn't get a diverse range of people, and they're kind of assuming that this is representative of a whole country. It might even be a small survey set. We don't know how many people are included in the United Pacifists of America newsletter mailing, but it's not a diverse range enough to say all of America. Same thing with Florida, California, and Maine for people who spend time near the ocean. If they had included Colorado or Missouri in that study, they would have gotten very different numbers. So it wasn't, one, a large enough, there's only 3 states here. There's not a large enough sample or a diverse enough sample. So you have to make sure that the sample they're using is large and diverse enough and actually fairly represents the conclusion that they're trying to draw. I'm just going to go over these last two. Dogmatism and unwillingness to consider the opponent's argument. Not that anybody ever does this, especially when it comes to political things. It kind of assumes that only you can be correct, even when many other people believe otherwise, and an unwillingness to even consider what they have to say. It's kind of related to the either-or fallacy because it assumes that competing theories or perspectives can't coexist. That you're being rational and everyone who disagrees with you or everyone on the other side is biased and you're the only one being objective or only your side is being objective. And that both sides can't be a little biased and that both sides can't have good, solid views. It also, it can also, another example of it is suggesting that your argument is the only acceptable one within a community. So people will, when you hear people like writing off with extreme language another opinion by saying, you know, people who believe this, this whole opinion is inappropriate, or everything they believe is outrageous, or only an idiot would believe this. Over applying a theory at the risk of not considering gray area or individual situations. So for instance, when it comes to like welfare, assuming that welfare is completely wrong and all those who partake in it are lazy, and over applying that at the expense of not considering individual situations, or, you know, maybe your own personal stuff. So even though you accept federal financial aid for school, or would accept state aid in the case of a catastrophic accident or injury. So even though you would accept state help, other people who do it are always lazy without considering any sort of gray area or individual circumstance. Cherry picking, we talked about, is where you ignore evidence that disproves your argument or opposing views, valid concerns, and you're not being fair-minded and truthful. When you're literally like looking at all the evidence and then just picking the things that make you look right and stacking the cards in your favor. It's important to show that you've considered a well-rounded argument. It is a conversation. So when you only look at your side, you're leaving out the conversation and putting it into a vacuum. And readers will pick up on that, and it'll hurt your credibility. We're going to do a couple of examples just with some visuals here. McDonald's. Over 99 billion served. A couple things wrong with that. There are not even 99 billion people on this planet, so that would be impossible. We don't necessarily know what like served is supposed to imply. Like you could assume like maybe 99 times people came around the window. It doesn't say that they were happy with what they got or that the food was good. Maybe they were coming back around because their order was wrong or to get more ketchup. Like, we don't know. But it's an example of appealing to that number. Well, a lot of people eat here. A lot of people have gone through this drive-through because a lot of other people trusted it must make it good. And the other, this other example, there's a couple of things kind of wrong with it. 9 out of 10 dentists can't be wrong. Just kind of sit with that for a second. They can't be wrong. It's a little bit dogmatic, kind of applying to that number too. Like, they want you to question yourself. Well, one of those 10 dentists disagreed. So they're kind of trying to make you just kind of question yourself there, and not to argue with it. They can't be wrong. This must be the best. But in fact, like, dentists are still fallible people, and lots of them may prefer different, toothpaste for different reasons. With this one, this is an example of ad hominem. I'm using McCain again. McCain campaign's ad spending now nearly 100% devoted to attack ads. First, I want you to think about like the design and the modes being used here. They want you to notice 100% attack ads. I wanted you to notice those words more than anything else and kind of emphasize that. Not nearly 100%, just 100%. We don't even know what nearly means exactly here, like what that number would be. But if you think about it, this is an attack ad. This is an attack ad attacking attack ads, and talking about how much money he's spending on attack ads without noting that they're also doing the same thing. And it doesn't say anything about his actual policies. And that's an example of attacking the character of a person rather than an argument. And you'll see it a whole lot in political ads. It's kind of the bread and butter of political ads, is to attack the character of the other person as opposed to their actual policies and things on their platform. So here's the practice you're going to do in your notebook. I'm going to show you an ad that is just chock full of all kinds of terrible things. And I want you to try to name at least 3 things that you see wrong with the logic being used here. So you don't have to name the exact fallacy, but try to notice 3 things that are wrong here. If you don't know Pamela Anderson, the only thing that you need to know about her really is that she is a celebrity, a little bit past her prime, but she used to be on Baywatch, and the important thing about Pamela Anderson is that this is what she looks like. And the ad is for PETA. All animals have the same parts. Have a heart, go vegetarian, and they have her all nicely marked up. And it says Pamela Anderson for PETA. So first, you could make a lot of good arguments about being a vegetarian or going vegetarian. This is not an example of a good argument. There are things wrong with this statement over here, with what they're doing here, all kinds of fun things, and with this Pamela Anderson for PETA thing. So there's lots of places you could look and focus on. Some of these are actually from examples of things we just talked about. So I want you to take a few minutes and look at this and see if you can write down 3 things that you notice on your own and then kind of come back to me. Okay, so hopefully you pause that and try to think of a couple on your own. I'm going to go through a few things. 1, all animals have the same parts. What? If you think about it, animals don't all have the same parts, actually. So that's kind of not true. What they want you to notice is how they've marked her up, and to kind of give you this visual to make you not notice that they just said something that wasn't true. So they have feet, leg, round, rump. They have all these are the parts they want you to notice as being the same. Because these are the way you would like purchase meat in the grocery store. But it's not necessarily a fair comparison because all animals don't have the same parts. And usually when and I want you to go back to the fact that a weak analogy is comparing 2 things when the conversations about them are not the same. The stake is not the same. When people are trying to talk about how we should be vegetarian for ethical reasons, they are talking about animals being similar to humans, and they're trying to talk about cognition, and they're trying to show that they have they feel pain, and that they can problem solve and reason, and that they love, and they're trying to draw those human comparisons that way, not physical comparisons. The fact that they have any sort of similar physical comparison isn't ever what we're talking about, and it's not really relevant to the conversation. Also, just flat out not being true. Have a heart. Let me go back. Have a heart, go vegetarian. There's 2 options. False dichotomy. It's a little bit dogmatic too. Either you're a good person with a heart, or you're a terrible, terrible person who eats meat. Without considering any gray area. And kind of being unwilling to consider that other perspective. So it's a little bit dogmatic as well. Pamela Anderson for PETA. She may or may not be a vegetarian, but she's certainly not an expert of any kind. They're just using her for 2 reasons. 1, she's Pamela Anderson. 2, this is what she looks like, and it's distracting because sex sells. Like, think about it. There's not really any reason for this ad for there to be side boob in it. Like, it's just unnecessary. But again, it's distracting. Kind of hoping that you will just notice Pamela Anderson in a bikini and ignore the fact that they didn't say anything that really, in terms of logic, makes sense. So I want you to write down these couple of things. This is going to kind of a couple of tips to avoid logical fallacies and arguments, especially in your digital essay. 1, make sure you're using valid reasons that are not overly emotional, that you can find evidence for, that you can explain, give examples of, and you can flesh out. Make sure your reasons have factual evidence. Make sure you're not making statements that are just based on your opinion without evidence. That's how you avoid the whole bias thing. And have a fair academic argument. And a lot of times we throw in our opinions and we don't even realize we're not connecting it to evidence. So sometimes it can sound easy enough, but it actually takes some practice and really kind of paying attention to where you're making claims and saying things that are debatable and don't have evidence, where you're drawing conclusions about a situation but don't have it based it on any sort of data. Verifying that the most important or relevant aspects of the issue are being addressed. So making sure you're not just being distracting in any way or kind of overdoing it in certain areas, or that you're pulling in information that's not relevant. Again, like bombarding people with unnecessary like background information or other types of information and stories and things that are going to detract from the argument. So you just want to make sure that what you're providing is really what's important to the issue at hand. Avoiding making claims and saying things that are emotional, zealous, sweeping, and can't be supported, and avoiding those absolute descriptors like all, always, everyone, never, that kind of stuff. Checking for fair acknowledgement and representation of multiple opinions or courses of action, making sure that you have other opinions in there, that you're not straw manning them. that you're describing them fairly in ways that aren't going to piss them off. So for reflection 1, this is going to be in your notebook, and this is really just kind of thinking about how this is going so far, or ideas you might have for how you can think about using some of these strategies in your digital essay. So the first prompt you're going to be answering is, can you describe at least one specific way you're appealing to pathos? So something that you're doing to explain with an example, with details, to really get your readers to visualize what you're saying, maybe to engage them in some way with things that are surprising or interesting or sad, things that are going to get them to connect with your issue, and have some examples here. Or what ideas can you come up with if you haven't really thought about this yet? Because remember, there's this is, regardless of who like your target audience is, there's always a place for pathos. If you're not appealing to emotions, there's still a place for appealing to their sense of needing to be able to visualize what you're talking about, needing to be able to see it and connect it and ground it in something that they understand, to make it more understandable to them. So visual images, how-to videos, things that let them see. Can you describe at least one specific way you're appealing to ethos? So we've kind of been talking about ethos and credibility all semester, even though like we're just really, like I've been saying, you know, ethos and credibility all semester. We're breaking it down a little bit more now, but it shouldn't be a new concept. We talked about it a lot with research, with being fair-minded, with the need to get other perspectives. So seeing that in your essay you are being a credible, knowledgeable researcher, you are, you know, citing sources, using sources, considering the whole conversation, providing clear information about where your sources are coming from. So introducing those sources well, especially your experts, explaining why, giving us their background, being confident in your tone, not being overly emotional, sounding like, because when you get too, you want to appear to your reader to be invested in your issue, but not so invested personally that it's making you appear biased. And that's where not being overly emotional kind of comes into play, because you don't want to appear biased. You want to appear fair-minded and rational, like you're giving other perspectives a fair chance. Can you describe at least one specific way you're appealing to logos? So this is logic. This is not just having evidence. This is having lots of different types of evidence, so not just experts. This is having statistics and stories and current news and studies and quotes from your experts. This is having lots of different types of evidence, especially multiple types of evidence within your sections to go with those. So not basing like one section on one source, because that's not very effective, just to have one source to explain a point or to prove a point. You need several things, and you need clear explanation. That's where that framing your sources comes into play. You shouldn't have statistics or studies or quotes from experts where you haven't explained like why it's there, where you haven't explained who this expert is, you haven't explained what the point of this information is, how you want us to read it, what we're supposed to take away from it. You never just want to have like quotes that, as we talked about before, are just sort of like, they just sort of happen in your paper and there's no introduction, there's no explanation, there's no commentary with them. Next couple, the first one here, the first prompt here is about kairos, which is an appeal that not a lot of people have really talked about a lot before. It's really kind of difficult to tell if you're doing it or not. It really is, are you saying the right thing at the right time? Are you giving us a tired report just with lots of random information, whether it's outdated or not? Like, are you placing this in the world right now? Can we see from what you're doing, like how this relates to things going on in the world right now, why this is important right now? That's where making sure you're using the most current like information and sources. Are you relating it to current news, current issues, current examples, things that are going on right now? So I gave you some examples of what you can maybe go through and look for with that one, some ideas for how you might be able to improve or add to that. I want you to think real quickly about which of these 4 appeals it seems like you're using the most. Like, does it seem like you are using a lot of logic and maybe need to balance it out somewhere? Because I mean, you want to have lots of logic, but logic isn't the only appeal. A well-rounded, effective essay needs to have all of the appeals, and it's really difficult just to have logic without having ethos, without having pathos to help explain and illustrate the logic, the reasons. Which one do you seem to be kind of struggling with the most? So just some things to think about to help you maybe go back and think about another way of considering rhetorical knowledge and rhetorical choice in this essay, and another way to go back and check and add and look for ways to make your essay more effective. If you have questions, please post them in the coffee shop. Peace. This is your reflection now to do in your notebook. I just want you to think about, we're going to come back to working with this in Studio 7 the same way you're kind of working with some previous things we've covered in Studio 6. I want you to take it a few minutes and just think about how your essay is going in terms of applying all 3 appeals. So you can talk about like fallacies if you want to, but just at the end of going over everything, I want you just to think about how you're using the appeals. So for now, can you describe at least one specific way you are intentionally appealing to ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos? So for each one, which of these 4 appeals are you using the most? So which one do you feel like you're leaning on? Which one are you struggling with? So either haven't thought of using yet or aren't really sure how to use it. So a lot of people get kind of stuck with ethos or stuck with pathos. Some people are really having trouble with your research and finding evidence for points you want to make, so getting kind of stuck with logos. Some people are, get stuck trying to know if they're really appealing to kairos and making it like relevant and current. So whichever one you feel like you're kind of struggling with the most right now. And then we'll see you in the next presentation. Bye.